hello everyone. Welcome back to the Junior Developer Podcast. Today we have Mae with us. We're gonna talk lot about design systems. So, hello Mae, how's it going?
Hi, it's going great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So, Mae is known for all of her work around design system. But for those of you who don't know about her, like, would you mind introducing yourself, like, about your work and all?
Absolutely. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation. Um, my name is Mae Capozzi. I am a software engineer in the United States, and I focus mainly on design systems, although I do other work around e-commerce, the Jamstack, just TypeScript in general,
Mm-hmm.
and React usually. So I've been working on design systems for about 3 to 4 years now, and I found it really interesting, really exciting, and I have done it at a couple of different companies. And I just love also helping other teams, other people work on design systems, understand the methodologies behind it, and yeah, so that's why I'm so excited to be here today to talk about it.
Awesome. So, you have been advocating design system a lot, even on Twitter, right? So, I think that's how I.
Yes.
So, if you could, talk a bit about like what exactly design system is in layman's terms, and how, how as an organization it would add some value to me.
Sure. So there's a lot of discussion in the industry about what a design system is. I have landed on my favorite definition, which I actually got from Gina, who is you should follow on Twitter. They are very like positive about um, design systems. They've been doing design systems for quite a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
They've actually coined the term design tokens, and they would say that design systems is more of a methodology. It's a way of thinking about how to build web products, how to build UIs, more than just like an actual artifact. And so I really like that approach. I like to think about it kind of in the same way as I think about agile.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of teams use agile to build uh, digital experiences, but at the end of the day, what they build, what those teams build, like can be very different.
Yeah.
And that's to me, design systems is the same. Like we do design systems thinking. We try to systematize um, our design, our web components, these different parts of what we do. But there's no such thing as like a design system necessarily. That being said, uh, a lot of people in the industry don't necessarily agree with that. So people do say like, "Oh, I'm working on this design system," and that's also totally fine to say. But yeah, that's just how I like to think about it.
All right. But as an
In terms of value,
yeah,
I could talk a little bit about that.
sure.
I kind of think about it in the same way as a pizza shop.
Okay.
So if you own a pizzeria, if you own a pizza shop, you know that you're going to be delivering pizzas, right? But you have a lot of different types of pizzas that you're
I
going to
like where
deliver.
this is going. Nice analogy.
Yes. And you probably have a system for how you're going to deliver those pizzas and how you're going to figure out which type of pizza is different, right? But you don't want to build every single one of those pizzas or
From
create
scratch.
every single one of those pizzas. Exactly. You want to at least know like the crust is always going to be the same, right? And maybe you have like variations of crust. Maybe you have a thick crust or a thin crust, but at the end of the day, it's still made with the same materials and you probably pre-made it. Um, and then you can have like additional variations on the pizza, like you can have pepperoni or you can have veggie or these different options, and
Mm-hmm.
they go through the same process, and they all like have the same foundations. But at the end of the day, like they are kind of like special pizzas. That's how I think about design systems. We are pre-fabricating parts of a website, so that when you want to create like a special website, you don't have to build every single part of it from scratch. You can pick and choose from these prefabricated parts,
Mm-hmm.
put them together in like a special way that maybe speaks to a certain brand or something like that, and deliver something like in a more timely manner.
So building blocks basically, which you could reuse in almost every other project, right?
Exactly. Yes.
All right. And like for an organization, does it make sense to have multiple design systems?
That is a really big question. Before I even get there, I also want to add that a major benefit of design systems is accessibility, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So another piece that's really important to me is to create really accessible building blocks that can be, and then provide guidance around how to put those together in an accessible way so that we're creating websites that everyone can use, and we're not like preventing anyone from
Yep.
using the service that we provide. And I think this is important across the web. It's
Couldn't agree
especially
more.
important for government websites, um, for websites that help you access medical care. So much of this is online now, so accessibility is so critical.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in
Cool.
the
So, okay. Oh,
yeah,
go
go ahead.
ahead.
Okay. I think the last podcast which I did with Neha, so we talked a lot about accessibility, and
Mm.
so when I share this videos, right, with this podcast around my friends and all, a lot of them were not aware of what accessibility is. They were like, everyone was just building product for folks who are not disabled at all. So I felt so bad. Like,
Mhm.
this is something that everyone should advocate, right? And I'm glad that you are one of those
Mhm.
folks who are doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to add that building accessible websites isn't just about checking items off a list so that people with certain like visual impairments can use it. It's about a lot more than that, and it benefits everyone. It's about usability.
Yep.
Can everyone use it? And oftentimes, making text larger, for example, doesn't only benefit people with a visual impairment. It benefits everyone
Yep.
because people are looking at things on different types of devices. People have different, um, are glancing at things and they need to see it look big. It's like information hierarchy is helpful. So yeah, accessibility is really important. If anyone listening to this doesn't know about it, definitely research it a bit because it's critical.
Yep. Now let's go back to our previous question on multiple design systems.
Yes, absolutely. So, first of all, I'm going to start by saying that some companies shouldn't have a design system at all. So, let's start there.
Okay.
Zero design systems. If you have one code base and one application, and you don't need to provide things like theming, you don't need to share parts of your code base across different code bases, I would say that you don't need a full fledged design system unless you have a very, very large code base and you are kind of like an established company. Like if you're a startup, design systems, like creating these systems is takes a lot of investment. And so if you don't have product market fit yet, you should not be spending time on something like a design system because you need to be focusing on iterating very quickly,
Yep.
figuring out, what your site even should look like to improve your conversion, things like that. So that's my first caveat. Like design systems are not for every single team, and that is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then at some point, a company reaches a phase where maybe they are trying to build a lot of marketing sites very quickly, and maybe they're even like offloading that to marketers. Like they don't want their engineers building those kinds of things, or they have two or more different web applications. So um, there were a couple of different brands that kind of all shared similar e-commerce flows.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made a lot of sense to have a component library
Yep.
and a design system to support those different brands. So we weren't building the same PDP product display page
Mm-hmm.
every single time from scratch. At that point, I think it's reasonable to have one. But at some point, you get to a stage where you're supporting um, multiple different brands that are like significantly different looking and they have significant different needs, or you're supporting um, different types of services. So you might have like an internal tools team and you might also have like a front facing website, and while the underlying elements that you need, like their behavior, could be shared, so everyone needs a button, right? um, the way that that button looks is so different, and the way that that button is grouped with other components is so different that you actually may want to add another layer to your system, I would say. So it's all part of the same system, um, because it follows similar rules. Like ideally, there would be like a core web design system that focused on building those like building blocks, like button, link, tab, that sort of thing. And then there might be like a more product specific component, or sorry, product specific design system that is like the internal admin notification or something. And that groups those core elements together in a way that really only makes sense for one part of the business. And that idea comes, at least I learned about that idea from Spotify's Encore design system.
Okay.
So if people wanted to learn a little bit more about that, they could look up Encore design system Spotify and see kind of how, at least as far as I know, Spotify is approaching this problem.
I think even Google has multiple design systems, but I'm not sure how many of them are open source. But yeah, so are you suggesting that having a central design system, then maybe like product based market fit, like not market fit, but product based whatever it is, you will write a wrapper around it and then leverage that as a design system for a particular product. Is that what you're implying?
Yeah, pretty much. What I'm basically saying is that there are parts of a system that can be shared across many code bases. So design tokens is a really good example. That can even, I mean, design tokens can even be shared multi-platform.
Yep.
But at some point, we get to a stage where we it's very difficult to share. So it's pretty difficult to share components between an Android app and a React web app, right? Those are very different. So even though at its core we have the design tokens that are still shared, there are separate component libraries at least.
Yep.
That support those different products, and then from there we might have a React web app that is consumer facing and another one that is internal facing, and those have very different needs. For example, the internal facing one might have a lot of tables and might need very small inputs and buttons because it's for kind of like power users. At that point, you might have a, I guess what Spotify would call it is a local design system that really only supports the admin side of things, and it takes those core web components and applies like the specific business logic to them, or applies the specific styling to them that is special for that part of the business.
All right, sure, that makes sense. Yeah, understood. Also, like when we are actually talking about building design system, there are a lot of philosophies around that, but there are two major philosophies which everyone talks about. That is the atomic design and Radius's philosophy of layering design systems, right? So you can talk about both of them. Like, what are your thoughts around them?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this a bit, and I sort of think that they're getting at the same idea. I don't really see them as being disparate, and I use both when I think about design systems. I do like the term layering. I think about that a lot, but at the end of the day, I think atomic design is the same idea. For those who aren't familiar, atomic design is, at least as far as I know, Brad Frost's approach to thinking about the types of components and parts that you might have in a design system. And at the end of the day, Radius is getting at the same idea. It's like, what are the different parts and how are they stacked on top of each other? So yeah, the way that I think about both of these ideas is, let's provide names that designers and developers can agree on to describe the different types of components in the system. So to me, I like to say that the lowest layer, so I think what atomic design would call atoms, and what Radius, I believe, would call design tokens.
Yep.
I like to think of as something like foundations. It's all the foundational parts of your system that can be shared with everyone at the company. So design tokens are certainly part of that. Even content guidelines, like writing styles, could be part of that. What primitives are you actually applying? So like, what colors are your design tokens pointing to? That's the sort of thing that would be there. Above that, there's what I like to call elements. in my mind. Again, these words are going to be different at everywhere, and that is okay. Like, I think that
Let's call this Mae's philosophy of layering design systems.
yes, exactly. I mean, I actually did write a blog post about this too. So people can check that out at my blog if they want at
Sure.
maecapozzi.com. But
I'll link that down in the description. Yeah.
great, sure. So I also think that atomic design is an incredibly useful way to describe this concept, but it's so many people have used it for so many different things that when you go to your team that's working on design systems, everyone's going to have a different perception of like what is an atom and what does it mean to be an atom. And some people on your team are going to be wrong, like they're just going to have forgotten or applied it incorrectly over the years. And so at least with my team, I try to create new language that everyone on the team can agree with, because I want to make sure that we're starting from scratch and everyone truly is on the same page about what these words mean. But anyways, the way that I think about it is we have foundations and then we have elements above that. So that is like single functionality components we've got. And it's not different multiple components grouped together. It's like the smallest version of a component you can have. So a button, a link, a tab. And then above that, we have patterns. So that is a group of elements. And that would be something like a button group, a tab list, a radio button list, or a radio list. And so these are so a pattern is just combining elements together to create a group of them. And these are obviously very common. So to me, that's what I like to focus on. Like in the early stages of a design system, that's what I'd focus on. And then at some point, depending on the business case that you have, you may go up to this like higher level, which I would call layouts. And that is combining different patterns together in ways that are common across the business. So that's something that if you have only a couple code bases and they're all kind of similar, you might have one design system and it contains all those layouts. But as you grow and scale, you actually may have all of that in a number of different satellite design systems that are specific to the business function that they are part of.
I mean, so we also, like, based on my experience earlier, which you mentioned, right, that someone's perception of a certain, let's say molecule, what molecule is, that might be different, right? So what worked out in my experience was to have a document on set ready where we all agree on what this particular layer would be called, right? So, and we can have that.
I totally agree with that.
We can have that in the README of the GitHub repo as well. So that solves most of the problems.
Totally. And I think what I'm really getting at here is if you are working on a design systems team, don't try to rely on existing hierarchies that are out there on the internet. I think those are really good guides and hopefully you can use them, but just know that people are going to have different perceptions of what they mean than you are. And so it's really important to align as a team on what language you're going to use, especially between the designers and the developers.
Yep. Sure. So let's talk a bit about the foundation layer, as you call it, the design tokens, right? So if you could talk a bit about like what would be the best way, or how do you actually organize design tokens?
Sure. So design tokens is a fairly complicated topic, which is interesting because at its core, it seems very simple from a technical perspective. So before we even talk about how to organize them, I kind of want to try to describe them. And to me, design tokens is a way to organize style data that the rest of your design system knows how to consume at its basic. So a lot of people, when they picture design tokens, they picture a key value pair. And I think that's a pretty good example. Like that's at its core, that's what it is.
Ground level, that's what it is.
Right. That being said, it varies significantly between companies and between teams. And I think that's okay. Like, I think that's why I like to say that design systems is a methodology, because even though we're all trying to create systems, the systems we create will be very different all the way down to the key value pair at the bottom of it. And that's okay. And that's why it's so difficult, because everyone really does. There's not like a core spec. That being said, I think there's a W3C working group, I believe. We'll have to check if that's actually correct. But there is a group working on creating a design token specification that can be shared.
Interesting.
Which would be awesome, because that allows us to build tooling around it that can be used by people like across the industry. So that is happening. And so they'll be better at describing the best way to organize design tokens than I'll ever be, because I think about it all the time.
Sure.
But to me, the most important thing when you talk about design tokens is to make sure that you are doing as much as you can to abstract away the actual color or spacing value that the token is pointing to.
The whole theming layer.
So you want to make sure that the tokens are as generic as possible. They are not named in a way that is specific to some part of your code base, and that the consumers of them don't need to know anything about the actual color they happen to be pointing to at that moment. So to try to describe that, an example of a kind of poorly named design token, probably the worst one would be like green. If you just named it green and pointed it to the color, a hex code that was green, that's probably the worst case scenario, because the likelihood that will always point to green is really low.
Yep.
So when you start pointing it to purple, it's going to get really confusing. So that's worst case scenario. Second worst case scenario is naming it something like super, super specific to where it is used. So let's say that you call it background nav secondary or something. The likelihood that you're only going to use that token in that single place is very low. Kind of part of the reason you're using tokens is because you want to be able to reuse them across.
Yes.
So once you start using it in the footer, people are going to get confused, right?
Purpose, yeah.
Right. So to me, the best approach is to come up with super generic names like primary, secondary, tertiary, or accent secondary, things like that, so that you can use them everywhere and they're not context specific. And when you change it, what it points to from green to purple, nobody minds. It doesn't matter. So that's really important about naming. I also think that there are different types of tokens. I'm kind of talking about what I, in my mind, refer to as global tokens. So they can kind of be applied across the whole system. They're kind of the top level.
Okay.
I think that there are also component-specific tokens. It's almost like another layer. So you might have your buttons component styles, and those can point to the global tokens. So the background color of the button might be accent secondary, which may point to purple. So you kind of create these layers even within your tokens as your system becomes a little bit more advanced or sophisticated. And I also think the other piece is, besides just organizing, it's kind of how do you implement. That's the other complicated piece, because there are a couple of different ways that I at least know in the web world. And so just to give, if people are thinking about this, there are really to me, there are two good approaches. One is via React context.
Okay.
And this is React specific, but via React context. So you would create something that you might call a theme provider, and you would pass the theme or the theme object into that. Say that again?
In the wrapper, in the top level, right?
Yes, exactly. And then the other option is CSS variables are very popular. And there's a lot of conversation and debate around which is better and why. You can totally look that up.
Let's not get into
dive in there.
CSS. Yeah, let's not get into that controversial.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna even say my opinion because I don't want to. Yeah.
Sure. So even like when we are working on a design system, right? So it's basically a teamwork between developers and designers. But the way developers think about components are completely different compared to the way designers think, right? So like, how do you manage? If you can speak a bit about that.
Sure. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm really glad that you're asking this question. Um, and I'm an engineer, so I can only really speak to what I see
Mm-hmm.
designers doing. So I don't because I do think about it from an engineering perspective. But from at least recently, what I've seen is designers tend to think of every single possible variation of a component as a different component, whereas engineers tend to think of every single variation as the same component with like different configuration.
Yep.
Um, and I don't think that there's anything like inherently wrong with thinking about it either way.
Yep.
I actually think that it's really helpful that designers can look across like the designs for an entire company and pick out every single instance and like categorize it in that way. Like I think that makes it much easier to see like what are the opportunities that we have with this component, what kinds of use cases do we need to support. Um, but what can get really challenging is that it's not hard it's not as hard for designers to like find every single possible instance and like design it as it is to build a single component that can support everything. So I do think that where you can run into a little difficulty is designers kind of expect like the first version of the component to support all of those possible variations, and it could be like 100, right? Uh, and then we end up with 50 props and like tests are breaking. It can get really complicated on the engineering perspective. So I do think it can be so valuable to work really closely with the engineer or with the designers on your team if you're an engineer, and even like pair with them. So you code in front of them and show them how you're thinking about like how to implement these different states, or sorry, not states, these different variants. Uh, and then also to make sure that uh, they can see like how difficult it is to maybe support everything and help them to kind of get all of those potential variations down into like the core group that we really need to support, and then we can always add additional ones, or what's the like main functionality of this element, right? And then can we like provide kind of like pre-configured variants on top of it so that like the engineers using it don't need to like every time like pass 100 props to like get the exact button that they need. Yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Yep. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it's a teamwork, right? It's a two-way process. So designers also should essentially empathize with the developers, right? Only then it will essentially be a success.
Absolutely. And I actually think that one of the most interesting things that has happened to me lately is working with a UX writer.
Oh, okay.
So which has been I've never done that before. It's very recent that I did that. And she was really knowledgeable about like information architecture, which so much of building a component isn't really. I mean, there's a lot of technical stuff that goes into that, of course, but the really important part to me is designing the API.
Yep.
Like, what props are you going to provide? Like, how are you going to have people pass the appropriate data in, and how are you going to like explain to them what like via names of props, like what they actually need to pass. And so having that person kind of join the conversation allowed the designers to really understand more of like what the engineers are thinking about
Okay.
in terms of like how important is naming, how important is like organizing the props in a certain way, um, how important is it to describe like the different props really well. And so that actually, I think, allowed designers to empathize more with engineers, to have like this expert in content be there. So that was really cool.
Yep. Do you like have a mental model when you think about, designing the API of a component? I'm sure there are good ways and bad ways, right? But how do you like?
I think that when I was a little more naive, I thought it makes sense to like group different props in a special way, or it makes sense to only show the really important props at the top level and then hide everything else maybe in a separate prop.
Did
But
that work
now
out?
I can see no, no, I never actually implemented it because I ended up asking people like the consumers of the design system I work on, and they hated it.
Straight no,
So
straight no.
now, yeah, they were like, absolutely not. So what I've landed on is keeping things as close to HTML elements as possible seems to be preferred, at
Mm-hmm.
least at my on my design system. Try to keep things within the mental model that people already have, and really focus on providing good documentation. Um, so that's but I do think naming is still very important. So you do need to think carefully about if you're providing props that are not on the underlying HTML element. You do need to think carefully about how to name them. Um, the thing I do have a lot of opinions on is flexibility. And that to me is the most controversial topic in design systems that I've run into. It's very hard for teams to agree on how flexible should the system be, and that's actually another place where designers and developers tend to disagree. I found that
I think this
designers,
is this is a three-way process, right? There's someone who is
yeah,
building the design system, designers, and also the consumer developer. All of them have to agree on certain things, right?
right, and that's very difficult. I totally agree with that, and I think that designers tend to want the system to be stricter. Like they want it to be less flexible. They want to be able to really enforce what everything looks like. And I think developers tend to want the system to be really flexible. They want to be able to kind of create whatever they want out of these elements, and they want to be able to do a lot of like overriding.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I like this idea. Jason Langsdorff blogged about this a while ago. We can put this link in the show notes too.
Sure.
This idea called progressive disclosure of complexity, and the main idea is that we want to show our users and make possible for our users like the default state really easily. Like we
Mm-hmm.
want to provide the defaults. Like we want people to drop it in, and that's really easy. But at some point, we're going to get power users. We're going to have teams that want to experiment, and we don't want them to have to completely opt out of our system at that point. We want them to still be able to use our components, and we also want to be able to see like how are people trying to change our system. That's really important. So we want to allow them to take on more complexity. So maybe they can override parts of our component, or they can pass children to the component or something like that. But it's a little harder for them, but they still can achieve what they're trying to do, like within the confines of our system. So to me, like one way that I really like to implement that concept into real life is when I was talking earlier about patterns. So these are groups of elements, so like a radial list, a tab list. I like to provide kind of two different ways to implement that sort of a component. One is that you just pass some data in, and the component renders itself for you in the like default way,
Mm-hmm.
or you can pass children to it, and it can look however you want,
Yeah.
but we can still store the state for you, and we can still make sure that it's accessible and things like that. And so that's the kind of the approach that I like to take, and that's something I think about when I'm designing a components API.
So you try to keep both of this together, or you go with one of them? Like,
No, I try to implement both. So
oh,
like in a pattern style component, like a radial list,
mm-hmm.
you could maybe pass a prop called, I don't know, uh, data or something, and it's like an array of objects,
Mm-hmm.
and it has all the data about the tabs.
Mm-hmm.
So it has the names of each tab. It has different information about like what's in the panel below, things like that. And that's kind of the easiest way to use the component. So hopefully most of the designs, if they're following the design system like to a T, all you have to do is plop it on the page, pass the correct data, and it will just show up the way that you want. But in a case where maybe a designer is trying to design something that's a little bit
more flexible,
new, that maybe they're trying a new pattern, or they have a new business case and they need a slightly different component that still has the same functionality as any tab list, because at the end of the day, tab lists are really all the same, but it looks really different from the like default one we gave. We want to make sure that that's possible to implement still using our tab list, because we don't want someone to, build a totally new tab list. It takes them 2 weeks because it's kind of hard to build. They didn't think about this, and this, which we've been thinking about because we've had this tab list for 2 years or whatever. We want to make sure that they can still use our system, and there's enough flexibility in the system that it can look really different, but it can still like use the functionality. And then ideally we'll have some way to actually track that someone has made a change to the system. Like maybe that you have like an override ID on that component, and you can only use the flexible part of it by passing data to that override ID so we can track it. At that point, we can actually see, oh, here are all these variations that people have tried to create on the tab list. Let's actually pull that back into our system and make that like much easier for people to implement. Yeah, so it's like a way to allow for flexibility when it's needed without making people like leave the system, and keeping developers less frustrated. And it's a way for us to like be able to find these places where people are trying to change the system. And if it's done, 2 or 3 times, maybe we need to rethink our component, and we can like make it more built in, that variation.
I'm sorry, I did not understand one thing. So do you add an analytics layer if someone is using the second way? Is that how you figure out that this component is being used this way?
Right. So that's one way that you can do it. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
I know that's something that Facebook does. And it's useful for like really large systems to be able to track the types of overrides people are making.
All right. Sure. I want to talk a bit about strategies on, how to version your design system, right? So there are a lot of ways to go about doing that. If you can talk a bit about, which ones worked out for you, which one did not. Yeah.
Yes. This is my favorite topic, so I'm ready.
You have written a blog post on this, right? I've read it.
I've written a lot about this.
Yeah,
I think that I think that a lot of people working in design systems have really emphasized the component architecture, design token side of things, which is kind of like the core of a design system. Like that makes sense to me. I think there's kind of like a hidden cost of design systems, which is all of the like infrastructure and automation that you need. So I call the type of, and this is like not caught on. I want this to catch on, but it's really, I think I'm the only one, or I don't know too many people who are using this term, but I like the term front-end infrastructure engineer. So like that's what I would call that's the type of title I would use for the engineer on a design systems team who really focuses on release strategy, versioning and publishing, the structure of your component library, Figma scripts so that you can sync with Figma, Slack integrations so that everyone gets notified when you publish a new version. All these sorts of like ways to kind of make these make the communication process a little more automated. Like that's really important, and it's kind of, I think it's like underdeveloped when we talk about it in the industry. So for me, in terms of versioning a design system, I think that there are options. And I think it depends on, again, the size of your team, what your team looks like. I would say that almost always you need to version your design system. The only case, and this exists and it works well, so that's why I say like there are cases where you don't need to do it, but the only case that I know of is if you have a component library that if your whole team Like all the code bases at your company are super well tested, like really high, above 80% test coverage. And they all use TypeScript, or some typed language. Um, and you have a ton of confidence about your like CI process.
Confidence is
Um,
the keyword here.
right. Then, okay, maybe you don't need to version it. And you don't have like a multi-brand system. Like you are only supporting like a single
Yep.
theme. Then I think you maybe don't need to version things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's like one company that's like that. I don't think that that's very common.
Yeah.
And the problem, like when you don't version your system, you end up in a situation where the design systems team, which might be a team of like 3 people or something, is suddenly responsible for the interface of every single other team's code base. Like that creates this huge point of failure.
Mm-hmm.
That I think could be really drastic. So to me, like I think that versioning is the way to go. So how do you do it? Right. Again, it depends on your team and how your code base is structured. I tend to prefer to implement like a monorepo structure for a design systems component library.
Okay.
This is for a couple of reasons. One is that I think that the design systems team is working on some very like disparate types of work. So we have the components, but we also have like scripts that allow you to share tooling across different components or different teams. So maybe you have your TypeScript config that's shared. You have your Jest config that's shared, etc.
etc. Yeah.
ESLint, exactly. Webpack or whatever your bundler is. So that's an example. Maybe you have like tooling so that you can automate. You have a Slack bot or whatever, and that lives in there. And so because I think that there's all of these different tools that you may need to create, it can get really confusing if they're all in a single repo.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you want to be versioning and publishing them, right?
All
And
of them.
you don't want to, yeah. And so you don't want to have to like have a different release strategy in every single repo, and you don't have to want to reinvent the wheel of your release strategy everywhere. So to me, I tend to like to create like a Lerna managed monorepo. And I tend to use independent versioning. So we don't have to get super in the weeds there, but Lerna provides 2 different types of versioning, fixed and independent. I prefer independent. And then I like to use Lerna's scripts, their version and publish scripts, to actually like implement the versioning and publishing flow. Lerna is very like configuration heavy, so there's a ton of flexibility in the library. It can be hard to figure out. Yeah,
that's part, but also demerits are there, of course.
Exactly. It can be difficult because there are so many different options that you can pass. It's hard to always figure out like which ones you need. But I do like it because I don't want to be writing all these scripts myself, and I like the opportunity to like actually create the appropriate versioning process for whatever library I'm working on. I tend to use conventional commits. So now I'm getting really in the weeds, so please stop me whenever. Okay, great. So conventional commits is a commit specification where humans can write commit messages in a certain way, and machines can read it. So whenever I'm implementing like a versioning and publishing flow, I always have everyone write these conventional commits, and then the system, and this is built into Lerna, like there's a flag for this, can read the type of change that's been made and can apply the appropriate semantic version automatically. And it will also automatically generate a change log with the commit messages. Yeah, for you, which is great. So that now instead of like having to sit down and see all of these commits that you're not clear what types of change they are, and then you have to figure it out, and then you've got to like manually set the semantic version, and then you have to manually write the change log. In this case, like your whole team is tagging each of their commit messages like, this is a bug fix, This is a minor change. This is a major change. And then when you're ready to actually like do the release, like Lerna has kept track of all of these changes for you and auto generates the changelog and applies the correct semantic version, which just gets published to your registry.
Okay, so the strategy is when you go ahead and bump up the version of the whole design system, but there's also a strategy where you would want to have this versioning per component level, right?
Yes. So, from at least in the way that I'm currently describing it, that's the difference between fixed versioning and independent versioning.
Okay, okay.
That Lerna provides. So, independent versioning, let's start with fixed versioning. So, fixed versioning means that when you go to publish, every single package in your monorepo. So, let's say that you have it set up where it's like you have package A, package B, package C.
Mm-hmm.
Under fixed versioning, everything gets published to the same version every time you publish.
Okay.
With independent versioning, it will check to see like which package actually changed. So I only made a change in package A. So now that I'm publishing, okay, only package A is going to get a new version, and everything else is going to stay. So I personally like that because I think it allows us to deprecate things in a way that makes a lot of sense. I think that it reduces like the amount of churn in the library. Like I really only want to bump a version if something actually changed. It means that each package, it has its individual change log, so you can just pull like whatever small part from the design system you actually want. So for example, say we have a package called components, and then we have a package called scripts, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't want the scripts, but they do want the components. So they're only pulling that code into their project. They don't have to, deal with all this extra JavaScript or whatever in their project. They can just pull exactly what they want and only kind of keep track of that package.
Interesting. Sure. And how would you go about, operationalizing the success metric of a design system? Is there a way to do it?
Yeah. So I think the hardest part about all of this is deciding on your release strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's questions of how often are you going to release? What types of releases are you going to offer? And how are you going to like express when things are stable? So to me, like the most basic approach, this is like, your MVP approach is you just want one type of releases. It's just stable releases. And maybe you want it to happen every time you merge to the main branch. That's kind of the easiest thing that I would start with. Mm-hmm. From there, and maybe that's like, every time you merge a PR, it happens. Okay, so now let's say your library gets a little more advanced. Maybe you want to add pre-releases. So that's like experimental versions. And then you want to say, oh no, like we only do a stable release like when we're sure. So maybe now you have pre-releases that have maybe you can say like import name of library at next, and you can get this experimental version. And then maybe every week you manually cut a stable release, right? So you can kind of add these additional types of releases on like as time progresses. But I think the main thing is you just need to sit down and decide who are my consumers? How much stability do they need? How likely are they going to be to care about using experimental releases versus stable releases? And then in what ways am I comfortable with more manual process? In what ways am I more comfortable with like an automated process?
All right, that makes sense. So the last thing I want to touch upon would be, if there are any tips you would want to give to someone who is, starting to work on a design system from scratch. So this is your time to enlighten that person, give away your wisdom.
Sure. It is very hard. I think it's a very hard challenge. And I think that it's very different from other types of technical challenges, in that it's very people focused and almost customer service like. It's probably the most customer service like job you can have in tech. So be prepared to have a lot of discussions around how to understand your users, how to support them well, how to provide stability for them. You have to listen to them and hear the types of issues they're having. And you have to be prepared to, even within your team, have a lot of discussions, and be ready to disagree respectfully. And I think that is the most important part. And then also just know that the first iteration of anything is not going to be the best iteration, and that's okay. So
It's a learning
it's
process.
better to get it out there. Yeah. At some point, it's better to ship it than to continue to go in circles trying to decide about the name of a prop. And so the best thing to do is get the feedback, and know that, in the early days of it, there will be breaking changes. You'll have to change things, but eventually you'll stabilize.
Awesome. Cool, May. I think that's all we have. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I had fun in this discussion. I personally got to learn a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was awesome. I loved it.